Okay, I'm going to give you a short overview of the Jefferson reading, kind of organized through the PowerPoint. I want to emphasize basically his overall plan, like what he was proposing, who he thought should be educated, how he wanted them to be taught, and then the values and things that he kind of inscribed in it. And Jefferson, obviously incredibly influential, probably one of our most highly regarded and well-known founding fathers, who was part of the Declaration, known as the author of the Declaration of Independence, even though it was a committee that put it together, and part of then the Revolution, the U.S. Revolution, and then the Constitution and development of the country, and then a later president. But when he's writing here, he's writing from Virginia. The reading that we did, he's coming from Virginia a little bit earlier in his life. And I gave you two hard readings this week, and Jefferson was not a good author. His prose, his writing style is a little bit difficult to work through, but it was short, so I'm hoping you can kind of pick out kind of the main ideas. He's very well known, obviously, for the Louisiana Purchase, which more than doubled the size of the United States. But I think I'd just point out, like with a number of things, I always like to point out that Jefferson's a complicated person, and that there are just different ways to examine and look at. You can't just take everything about Jefferson on its face value. So for one, he was kind of the forefather of philosophical conservatism in the U.S., so he believed in very small government and questioned federal power. But here with the Louisiana Purchase, he used an incredible amount of federal power to purchase the territory and expand the United States. So in a number of things we see conflicts in Jefferson, and another I think good one is his views on slavery and humanity. And as a young man, Jefferson opposed slavery. He offered to take the cases of freed slaves pro bono to support them. He called slavery the I don't know, I won't get the quote, but basically the failure of the U.S. of the Enlightenment and the United States. So he knew it was wrong, but he not only lived with hundreds and hundreds of slaves at Monticello, at his plantation in Virginia, but he also, after his wife passed away, he started a relationship with a 15-year-old slave girl who was Sally Hemings. Now, people denied this for a long time, but he fathered 7 children with Sally. And it's a very complicated story, and people look at Sally in different ways and view their relationship in different ways. Obviously, as she was young and a slave girl, people see it as a very abusive relationship. But Sally, too, was able to secure her children's freedom and her own freedom through this relationship. And when they turned 18, they lived at Monticello. His children did until they were 18 from the Sally Hemings side. And I'm going to share with you a video that's connected to this. And if you get a chance to watch it, I would highly recommend it. It's short, and I think it's a very inspirational kind of look at how the two Jefferson families, his descendants from his first wife, and then his descendants from his relationship with Sally, how they've kind of reconciled and moved on. And there's a really good book on it, The Hemings of Monticello, by Annette Gordon. All right, so literacy is a major focus for Jefferson. He believes that everybody needs to be literate, and in order to self-govern, they needed to be able to read newspapers, they needed to know what was going on, and to be able to educate themselves. And if they were literate, he felt that they'd be able to do that. So again, like Plato, it's very much about society. Education, the reason for education is about preparing leaders for the new society and creating a stable society. And I just thought I'd mention he designed the University of Virginia, and you can even see his connection to Plato and to Athens in that time period in the architecture that he chose. So the columns, he used a lot of the same architecture at the University of Virginia that was used in ancient Greece. and he obviously had read Plato, and his education views, it should be pretty obvious, are influenced by Plato. This is something I've talked about in the past a little bit, just at the march and then pursuing demonstration um, that happened around the removal of some Confederate statues kind of flared up at the University of Virginia, and it was specifically targeting the Jefferson Memorial there. All right, so this is the general diffusion of knowledge from notes on the state of Virginia. We read in this section, and again, what we mostly get into is his plan. And here's basically a kind of a graphic organizer that I generally have students work through. So tier one was open, and I think it's important to put all in kind of quotes because obviously there are slaves at that time period. He didn't really fully flesh out education in relation to African Americans at this time period, but it was also at the same time revolutionary to propose education that would extend to people who couldn't afford it. It would be paid for through taxes, and that's important to know. He says by levies on the people, which means tax-supported, public-funded education that would be available to children of all backgrounds, and both to males and females. So this would be tier one is like for 3 years, the first 3 years, and everything had a very practical component to it. You would learn math so you could conduct your business affairs. You would learn to read so you could self-educate throughout your life. Um, and it was sort of a general education at that point. He also emphasizes history, and it's helpful if you look over the quote in the reading related to history. He says it helps prepare you to know the designs and intentions of men, and basically history helps you better understand your current situation, is I think what he's getting at. And then he suggests selecting the top, what he says, genius from each district. And that's another important thing to kind of to remember with his plan, that he wanted to divide the country up into I think like 5 square mile so districts, and then that would self-govern. And of course, obviously, that's the way we still do things today. So our school sort of structure is still based on that today. And that was very intentional from Jefferson. He wanted the community to be invested, and then he also wanted each school sort of run, by the community, which is sort of the school board model that we have today. So you have a board made up of people from the community who run the school. So again, going back to tier two, this was the top, quote, like genius, only males. He would only select males, and they would go on to a kind of boarding school where they would learn geometry, Greek, and Latin. And the reason for that would be, Greek was what you would have read the classics in at that time. You would have read the Republic in Greek, and Latin was the scientific language for scientific nomenclature. So even though he wants languages, I think there's, in a sense, a kind of practical reason for that. And then for tier three, this is the university tier. This is the top students selected from tier two would go on at public expense to a university, and paid for by public expense, and they would study something religion or philosophy. But this was to prepare them to become leaders in the new country. I put a picture up here of, you can see how Indiana is divided up by districts. So again, you can see those like sort of square kind of or rectangular areas divided up. Again, even though today we have far more control, federal control and state control over education, his idea was again to have people invested and to have community control. This is an Instagram hashtag people called Jefferson Squares. People take pictures from airplanes, and you can still see the way the country is divided up, which is what Jefferson wanted. This is tier two, and I put pictures at the bottom of the page of Indiana Academy, because this reminds me of like what tier two he's suggesting: a boarding school paid for through funding, but that kids could be selected for and sent to. And then William of Mary is the college he mentions. That's where he went to school. It's one of the oldest schools in the country after Harvard and Yale, I believe, um, to develop leaders. All right. I just, with the equality, I always like to point out that Jefferson to me has the same sort of complexity of Plato, where on the one hand, he believes that leaders should come from all different backgrounds and classes. But then two, also a very kind of narrow and elitist view in the sense of one, he ignores women, females going on, and then two, that he kind of has that quote like raked from the rubbish. The leaders, the geniuses are raked from the rubbish. So I think he also has this kind of elitist notion of generally how people are. And then again, two doesn't really envision people choosing leaders. All right. Here's his quote on newspapers. I think this is kind of helpful to remember, just in that he really promoted the idea of a free press. Believed obviously that people need to be able to read and learn from them. So freedom of the press is also another key Jeffersonian value. I often try to use it. I think there's a lot of interesting connections you can make to Jefferson in schools today. Freedom of speech has been specifically for schools has been interpreted by the Supreme Court on a number of different occasions, and where they've basically come down is by saying that students do have, to some extent, a certain level of free speech that's protected in schools, but that schools can implement rules and suspend and expel students who cause a disruption. There's a lot of really interesting cases. The Tinker case is one of the really first ones where kids wore armbands and were suspended for them, and the court said that they did have a right to wear those in protest of the Vietnam War as long as they weren't causing a disruption. And what's interesting is when you saw some of the walkouts recently around school shootings around the U.S., there was a walkout in favor of curbing violence in schools, and a lot of those students wore armbands, which was a reference back to the Tinker Supreme Court case. So I think this is where the PowerPoint begins to wrap up, and I just want to say, in terms of larger key ideas for me, I always like to point out a lot of people mention that education and public schooling spread in the United States because of industrialization, and there's undoubtedly truth to that. But I think it overlooks the fact that really the roots of education in the United States go back to democracy and the development of a society, a self-governing society. The big question is, if you don't have the king who's going to come and impose the rule of law and things like that, how do you get a group of people to work together and to collaborate? And and Jefferson's anxiety over this, the answer to it obviously is education, and that wasn't just for Jefferson; it was also for Benjamin Rush and a number of other founding fathers at that time period. And then two, I also like to point out, Jefferson is the forefather of political conservatism in the United States, limited government, and so forth. Didn't see a conflict with a public-supported public education system. He saw it as necessary. You can't have a self-governing society that's free and these kinds of things unless you have educated people who are willing to defend it. And I think that gets overlooked today, or there's a bit of a split and kind of a divide. That's something hopefully we'll talk about a little bit later in the session when we talk about vouchers and charter schools and the move, I think, away from support for public education. And also, I think another good example is Head Start. And I notice some of you are in early childhood or worked for Head Start. And Head Start was a program that was always supported by, was supported by Republicans like Ronald Reagan, George Bush. It resonated with those values of self-determination, those kinds of things. More recently, though, Head Start has seen budget cuts. You could say efforts to defund it, by certain people. And I think that's unfortunate, just that there is that kind of divide or split now. Um, but again, hopefully, kind of a theme or something we can